Testing, English channel. Channel, English channel, channel number two, this is English. Is it coming through okay? Testing, this is English speaking. English. Is it coming through okay? Okay, then.
Bonjour.
Good afternoon to all of you. Thanks a lot for spending 1 hour with us, a warm hour. We'll have a panel discussion. There will be a round table with 5 prominent people who are committed to institutional, civilian and corporate matters. And I hope that they will be able to listen to one another. They will answer your questions as well. We'll be addressing a key topic that transcends us, but a topic that we'll have to face head-on with Maxime Menuet, an economist, member of the Cercle des Economistes. And hello, Maxime. So he has a daunting task to introduce the topic, to understand and breaking the cycle of violence. The 5 speakers, they've experienced violence, they've combated violence, they are surviving on the theater of operations where they step in. And you will understand what it's all about, because I will introduce them. Shayda Nouri, you are the chairwoman, so hello. Chairwoman of the Association of Afghan Women in France, Hichem KHADHRAOUI. Mr. KHADHRAOUI, good afternoon. You are the Executive Director for the Center for Civilians in Conflicts, Dora MEREDITH. Good afternoon. You are involved in the European matters, European theater of operations, especially the cycles of violence that have bashed the European continent. Fortunately, for many decades, we have been very happy. We're very happy because we're in conflicts, but now there are some external conflicts, violent conflicts have emerged. You have lots of latent conflicts, information-based war, something that we'll be revisiting, so we'll be able to address the different challenges. So the Europeans and other people on other continents are suffering from violent acts. MORAD, you are the Chief Executive Officer of Honor Group. This is a company specializing in investment solutions and strategic management of projects in the field of infrastructures and logistics and media. Moreover, you are the chairwoman of the Women's Conference, and it's an organization, one of the biggest platforms regarding the empowerment of women. And at last, Madame Shayda HESSAMI, I didn't want to misspell your name. You are the founder and CEO of Humanitarian and Journalism, Humanitarian Aid and Journalism. You help women and you want to break these cycles of violence. When you're a journalist, when you're a woman, you are facing violence. Maxime Menuet, I will hand over to you. You have a daunting task to elevate the debate and will be able to get down to the nitty-gritty so that the five people, five specialists can exchange their views. So good afternoon, dear friends. Thanks a lot for being here for this panel discussion. So I'm very happy with this topic. It's a momentous topic, especially if you look at the current situation in the world. Thanks a lot, Laurent, for being the moderator. By way of introduction, I will start with the beginning, with the text of the Genesis. In the tale of origins, the first violence of humankind is not a war of civilization. It's not a battle for power. It's not a battle to get resources. A man killing a man, a brother killing a brother, Abel killing Cain, and it's where is your brother? Where is your brother? And I think that in terms of violence, we are incapable of nurturing brotherhood. The main fundamental problem is not hatred of the enemy, but the difficulty of withstanding the others. So Abel is unbearable to Cain because of frustration and jealousy, and violence emerges with this intimate experience of rivalry. This is what Freud understood at a later stage: permanent tension between the pulsations of life and death, between eros and thanatos. I think that altogether we need to accept this uncomfortable idea that men do not wage war because they are obliged to do that for economic and social circumstances. They wage wars because they enjoy making war. This war gives them power. Modern societies thought that they could neutralize these destruction drives with capitalism. Between the two world wars, Maynard Keynes developed the idea whereby, and I quote, man should be a despot on his bank account rather than on his fellow citizens. In other words, for Keynes, human passion should be focused on the search for profit instead of military conquest. So stock market is better than the battlefields. But what are we talking about? You have a lot of competition. There's fear. There are feelings of powerlessness. Violence hasn't disappeared, but it is different now. Some acts of violence are conspicuous for those who experience violence. As François said, violence is in the perceptions of people, in inequalities, in institutions. Céline Farr, a Senegalese economist, told us to move away from a civilization based on predation in order to have reciprocal and hospitality drives. Some African traditions wanted to preserve that. Have in mind the Senegalese teranga. It is not simply hospitality, but it's about reciprocity. South African Bonsuntu, the individual cannot live alone. So if you look at these situations, it's not a matter of focusing on the homo economicus. What is important is the awareness of a shared vulnerability, because fraternity, brotherhood cannot be implemented as a matter of course. It's important for people to meet. Mr. Fomentel says that hospitality is an immemorial value with some risks. When you welcome the others, you have to accept that you will be displaced by his or her presence. There are societies obsessed with ownership, closing borders, control of the sense of belonging, and in the end you will get the opposite: more loneliness, more fear, and more violence at the end of the day. Hannah Arendt said that it's important to get rights. The human beings shouldn't be deprived of political existence or dignity because of its status, origin, recognition, acknowledgement, attention are key fundamental needs of the human soul. By way of conclusion, the fraternal link is being torn apart. So I think that we need to come up with new ways of being brothers. Sisterhood is not a given, it's a work, it's a learning curve, and a difference is not perceived as a threat and becomes a way to interact with people. So the question for Kane is about your brother. Where is your brother? Cain killed Abel, but his answer was really familiar. Am I the guardian of my brother? Thank you. Thank you, Maxime Menuet. So we talked about elevating the debates and discussions so we can breathe the air of the mountains, the air of the intellectual summits. Mrs. Nouri, so what is your take on Mr. Menuet's comments? But as part of this panel discussion, you wanted to talk about the situation of Afghan women. So when we talk about the separation, when we talk about violence, violence can be waged. And men and economic systems can be responsible for violence, but seen from Afghanistan, the paradox of Abel and Cain has it to do with reality, what you are defending, what you are experiencing in terms of rights, what the Afghan women experience. Isn't it something very painful? So good afternoon to all of you. I'd like to thank the Cercle des Economistes for inviting me, and we are very moved by this situation. So the paradox, I've listened to Mr. Menuet. Violence is part and parcel of human beings. We were supposed to transcend violence, but in 2026, violence has been rife and rampant, not only in Afghanistan, but in other countries. So Afghanistan is making the headlines because Afghan women have been undermined by by men, because men have been using religion and men think that they are superior. So it's about patriarchy. It's a world of patriarchy. There's always a difference between the wages of men and women. Women cannot get access to senior positions, but there was a long struggle for the freedom of women, something that we achieved in France. In Afghanistan, some strides were made for 50 years, but with the Taliban at the helm in 2021, we are back to the Stone Age. So women cannot study, cannot sing. Women cannot take a bath in Afghanistan. Not everybody has a hammam or a shower. So most of the time, women will go to a collective sauna, collective hammam, and they are not entitled to do that. They cannot work. They cannot talk to one another. They cannot get some specific jobs. When they are at the airports, you are being searched by women and not by men. So why do they alienate women? So I went in Afghanistan twice. I drove for 7,000 kilometers. I wanted to meet women, and I questioned different women, young people, old people, and I asked them if the country was rich, and they told me, no, the country is poor. They didn't want women to be learned because women are bringing up the children. So women bring up the children. So when they are not learned, basic basically go and study, but in fact they are not entitled to be educated. So in the end, the population is alienated. So all the regimes, looted the country. The state coffins are empty. In France, we are complaining about the government, but in Afghanistan it's worse. So why? Since 2021, it has been said that there has been no economy. 40 million women, but it's very difficult to get a census in Afghanistan. But out of the 50 million, 25 million are alienated, and you have 12 million young girls. But the young girls, the 12 million young girls, they are not learned, they are not educated. So imagine what the situation will be in 10 or 15 years' time. So they are beaten according to the Taliban, and according to the Taliban law, they've decided to inflict bad treatments to women. So the body of a woman can be bruised, and it is authorized. So young children who are 8 and 9 are married forcefully. So I'm quite, and I'm against all that, of course. And I've traveled, and I've seen those little girls. They told me, I have no future. So I work. You have physical violence, but you have psychological violence as well. And you have these little girls, these little boys. We tend to forget about the little boys, and they are working. It's very hot here, but in Afghanistan it's even hotter, and you have young girls, collecting rubbish. So you have violence of work. We are complaining about our working conditions in France, nothing to do with the working conditions in Afghanistan. But I think that we've hit rock bottom. I'm a little bit disrupted because I remember my trip and I feel destabilized. And of course, I'm sad because the institutions are wearing blinkers in Afghanistan. And recently, the Taliban were hosted in Brussels with pomp and pageantry, and I don't think that I'm a European. So when you host these people in Brussels, at a time when we know what they inflict on young girls, young boys, adults, even young boys are bashed by the regime. These young boys, they wanted to live like the Westerners. Young girls, young boys, they cannot wear jeans, and recently they decided to burn trousers. If you wear trousers, you will get a fine. So the Afghan society is plagued upon violence, moral, physical, psychological violence. All types of violence are rife in Afghanistan, but they are hosted in Europe and in France. They left Brussels and they came to France, and I'm ashamed of being French. Most of the time I would say that I'm proud, because in France we don't recognize the regime of the Taliban, but when the Taliban are being invited discreetly by stealth, that's not acceptable. Equality, fraternity, this is not the right motto. I'm really infuriated. I'm fuming because of this situation. Dora, Meredith, can you provide us with an answer? Then I will hand over to your neighbor. We talked about Europe, we talked about violence, and Mrs. Nouri, you said that this is violence generated by Europe and European institutions. Do you share this situation? Some states who are living in peace, with institutions whereby civilian populations can live in peace, and they can bring about violence because they receive and host some leaders such as the Taliban.
couldn't agree more. Well, I should start by saying I hope you don't mind that I speak in English, and thank you very much for inviting me today. I couldn't agree more with your comments, and I think my intervention was going to be saying exactly that the way we design institutions and norms is absolutely integral to the outcomes around violence. And, you know, the reference earlier to markets and Keynes, markets alone don't diffuse rivalry and don't diffuse violence. They do it only when institutions around them are built to absorb grievance rather than concentrate grievance. And at ODI, our work across fragile and conflict-affected states really shows that cycles of violence are driven above all by structural inequalities. Who accesses finance, whose governance is called too risky, whose security gets prioritized, who gets invited, who gets invited.
It's okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. To engage with our governments and who gets given platforms. They're not neutral, technical choices. These are political choices made inside of institutions that were often built with good intentions, but they are now entrenching the opposite. They are stuck in old ways and very much need to transform to meet the world that we're in today. I'll say a little bit more about it. So I think institutions often don't fail through the absence of money. They fail through the absence of predictability and the absence of inclusion. And that actually is often a deeper problem. For example, a study published in Science in May looked across Africa when USAID was shut down overnight, and conflict rose sharply in the regions that had relied most on that funding. That's perhaps not so surprising, but the finding that I found most interesting was that the local institutional strength really did shape the conflict that followed. So weaker states saw much sharper increases in terms of conflict, and stronger, more inclusive institutions absorbed the shock. It wasn't just about the money leaving that drove the violence, it was the abruptness and how the institutional capacity or the lack of it was able to absorb the disruption. So I think, you know, the choice in front of us as we think about redesigning our institutions and how we can make our institutions better in addressing violence is thinking about how do we build our institutions to absorb such shocks. And indeed, Europe is not exempt from these questions, so partly in terms of how it is as an actor on the international stage, the norms it upholds, how it drives its strategy and thinks about how its institutions are designed, but also internally, democratic backsliding and rising inequality inside our own member states is generating new forms of violence at home, not just abroad. And our research shows a robust link between income inequality and democratic erosion. And so, you know, we see that similar things to the things that we're observing in fragile states elsewhere. And I think the final point I would make is that at the moment, as you may know, Europe is negotiating its long-term budget, the MFF. So we're currently looking at how Europe will invest over the coming years. And there's a lot of debate there around, you know, what is Europe's role as a global actor? What's the financing needed? How do we design the institutions to deliver that? And there's already this tension between some actors who really want Europe to be agile and able to respond to different crises as they come up, and others who want to try to drive a longer-term approach with predictable programming, which can be discussed with partners. And I think it's really important we get that tension right to make sure that we're designing finances and the institutions behind them that are inclusive and that are thinking about how we want Europe to be in the coming years, which should be absolutely asking these questions of the kind of strategy that should sit behind that and the norms that we're upholding.
Merci. Merci, madame. Je ne veux pas que le débat soit européocentré, donc, monsieur KHADHRAOUI.
I don't want the debate to be too European, Mr. KHADHRAOUI. I want to ask you to talk about Europe, but if I consider your organization, the objective is to defend civilians. During periods of tensions, during periods of war, the notion of a civil society, this is a value, this is a way of shaping the political relationships in a democracy such as France and in other countries. Do you experience that situation on a daily basis in Sudan, in Gaza, Yemen or elsewhere? So civil society, how civil society can be set in motion when a civil society is bombed or is buffeted by a war, not between two nations, but violence within a country. Thanks a lot for your invitation. I'm delighted to be here with you.
Durant ce forum économique, c'est important.
Talked about during this economic forum. Yes, we have to address the situation of civilians in conflicts and the role that civilians can have in this context. Since 2022, we have seen over 112% increase in civilian deaths. 112% increase since 2022, and the number of children and women killed in conflicts has gone up 4 times over the past 3 years. So the figures are humongous. Wars are longer, more deadly, and they are more expensive as well for society and the structure of society. Civilian lives, civilian infrastructures, whether we're talking about electricity production or water production, hospitals, they are all attacked deliberately. They are destroyed. When I go into conflicts, I'm going to the Sudan in a few days. I was in Ukraine recently. We now see an intention. It's not collateral damage anymore. There is an intention to break the spirit of civilians and to generate such expense that the other party decides to abandon, to throw in the towel. But now we see that nourishes this infernal cycle of violence, which is gaining in strength. So it's like violence under steroids with the arrival of new technologies as well. And one of the most economic ways of making war is to use drones. And the world is discovering, well, I personally have been working in the humanitarian sector for 20 years, but for the last 2 years we have seen drones show up. This was something which we have difficulty to intersect. So 400% increase in the use of drones in conflicts over the last few years. And that generates a constant feeling of threat. When you're in a conflict, the civilians had always experienced some downtime underneath attacks. They could organize themselves in those pauses. But when you've got drones flying over your head, you've got that constant noise. There's no downtime. There are no breaks. So the front lines are now everywhere, all over the place, all the time, for everybody. The right to wave that white flag is no longer around with drones, because even if you drop your weapons, you will still be theoretically attacked by a drone because you have a target on your forehead. So war is not becoming more humane, it's just becoming more deadly. in Western countries, countries of the G7, rich countries, our organization is working to get civilians' voices heard. Civilian protection isn't just something which is right to do, but it's also strategic for any type of negotiation or agreement which is going to last in time if security and economy is to be guaranteed. So what do? Technological developments today are so rapid. So when a state wants to regulate, to curb the impact of drones, then private companies are going twice as fast as that. And so governments have to talk with the suppliers of these drones, companies such as Palantir, which is the biggest industrial tech company. We also need to talk about the design of these killing tools and include respect for civilians in the design phase so that it's not at the mercy of the odd person. And to wrap up, I would say that the targets of mediation and peace are not merely transactions. You can't broach the end of a conflict in a mathematical mindset, saying how you're going to share out power and hope that that will be enough to bring peace. No, you have to inject an outlook for the civilians and include them in the discussion when you're developing an agreement to make sure that there is a lasting effect, particularly when the stakes are so high. And to wrap up, for me and for us at the CIVIC, it's essential to think of this in terms of when politicians decide to make war, when generals develop those wars, and when negotiations begin. Civilians have to be front of mind. Thank you very much. I don't have any answer to the question Maxime put at the beginning. Perhaps he'll come back, but for the time being, I still can't find Keynes and that ability to think that it's better that we express our desires in economy rather than in being violent. Because if you look at Sudan and Europe, etc., I see that the drone business and the tech business for war are getting on like a house on fire together. This is a short-term conclusion. I'm just the moderator. I'm now going to hand the floor to Madame MORAD to find out whether your point of view corresponds to these rather dark forecasts that the fellow panelists have already expressed.
شكرا. اسمح
d'accord, très bien, c'est plus simple. في مشكلة تقنية هيك بنحل.
يلا اوكي. مساء الخير.
Good afternoon, everybody. Excuse me, but I'm going to speak in Arabic and I'm being interpreted. I come from Egypt. It's an Arab state. It's in Africa and it's on the Mediterranean also. There are many conflicts in my region, and there are impacts. Of course, there's an impact on the peacefulness of society in the Middle East. I think if we are to break that violent cycle, it cannot happen without women. We have to support youngsters, we have to create jobs, we have to give education. Developed countries have to help other countries who are less fortunate, help them to develop, to help their economies develop. I think that the current conflict is not a conflict of civilizations between the East and the West. The problem is deeper than that. My fellow panelists have already broached this, touched upon it. But there are several countries that support violence in our region. Many of countries, even Western countries, are supporting violence in our country, and they want us to change. They're talking about us as if we're an underdeveloped country. Why? Well, it's all about trade. Weapons trade. Weapons are a very profitable business sector. And sadly, I believe that this is going to be the case for many a year to come. We really have to control the military industry. It needs to be dedicated to defense and not dedicated to profit. So that's my first point. We human beings, we live through a lot of things, and there are some things which federate us. We all want peace, development, prosperity. Economic complementarity is the solution. Cooperation between countries is the solution. We need to work to create opportunities to invest. We need to eradicate immigration, pointless immigration. Just imagine if we had better economic situations in these different countries, people would want to leave. I feel it's important for me to express myself in the Arabic language because I am speaking on behalf of the people in my country, and I know the Europeans are fed up with this, but thank you for listening anyway. Thank you very much, Mom. Shayda, HESSAMI, I'd like you to take the floor now, please. So, is hope about to return with you? Are you going to bring us the solutions? And can you see in what, or can you deduce from what your predecessors have said, a path? Not an idyllic path, but a realistic path. What kind of solutions can we have to break these rather dramatic cycles of violence? I would like to talk to you about something from my heart. I had written some notes, but I'm going to put those to one side. I really want to talk about what has already been said and the goal of this forum, and I'm delighted to be here to take the floor. The title of this forum today spoke to me immediately. We are really navigating in a world without any benchmarks or signposts. So as a human rights defender, I am sailing without any pointers. I run an association. It's a French association, but we work internationally. We're based in Iraq and in the Yemen. We have 4 or 5 female journalists who are activists who are in Iran, Egypt, Afghanistan, Tunisia. And thanks to our network of women who are really actors in peace, these women are working on stabilizing a world that is impacted by war. Military war, drones, but also an economic war and a psychological war. A territorial war and a war of information. That is perhaps the most violent one that exists today. Back in the day, wars were always violent. 100 years, 150 years ago, there were all of those battles, but today, adding this war of information is creating a social conflict, and I think indirectly, and Mona mentioned this, I could feel what she was getting at. There is this internal social conflict in these countries. And that is the result of all of the economic territorial conflict. And let's not forget, religious and ideological conflicts as well. I come from that region where the war is waging, but I'm also European. I've been a European for the past 15 years. I represent Europe and the danger that this war and these conflicts, which I have listed, how they are impacting Europe. So how are they impacting Europe? What's the link between the two? Well, wars today are not territorial. They go beyond borders. This war of information and fake news, all of that hate created in society, it's everything that's happening in Syria, it impacts Europe. Everything that's going on in Egypt, in Iraq, in the Lebanon, in Israel. Jews, Muslims, Christians, Druze, all of the minorities, all these different ethnies, they all have the right to practice their beliefs. They have the right to think. But I was in Damascus last year. Let me just give you one example. I was in Damascus, and I was in the Christian neighborhood. I was in a shop, wanted to buy some souvenirs. The shop, for 40 years, had been run by Joseph and Abdullah. I started to talk about the situation with them. This was October of last year. And they said to me, the situation has worsened. We are no longer free to live together. The first question that you get asked today is, what's your religion? But Joseph and Abdullah lived together, worked together for 40 years. And I hear the same things in Europe here. People are saying, well, a few years ago, no one gave a hoot about your religion or your ethnic. So that's a really simple example, just to say that we are all facing this danger and this violence. And today, I would just like to say a quick word, if I do have the time. Do tell me if I've not got the time. I just want to say that thanks our initiative, which is active in war zones with a network of women, we have carried out quite a lot of analyses. We went to Brussels, the European Union, last year to try and convince Europe to change its strategy, to modify the European strategy. And the importance of redesigning the strategy is because European strategy today no longer responds to the situation. And civilian society, of course, diplomacy is essential. Economic analysis is essential. We'll never be able to get by without those, but you have to understand also that human rights and freedom are just as important, and we have to strive to protect them. Let me say this once again. Everything that's happening in this context impacts us here in Europe, and we are seeing transnational violence, and we need transnational solutions without breaking any frontiers. Since last year, I've been trying to get Europe to implement a program which will stabilize and bring peace, but sadly that does not correspond to the geopolitical and analytical framework of the European Union. So that's very simply what I wanted to say, that women are important. Women journalists are important in war zones. They're not a symbol, they are strategic, because a woman's voice, the presence of women, is being reduced. They are attacked by wars, by bombs, by enforced displacement, and also by extremist groups. and by all of the violence which is coming into the different countries. I don't have the time to list how many of my colleagues and members of my network have been impacted by violence, even tortured and killed and put in prison. So I would like to stop with this by saying that women's rights without any frontiers is not symbolic. It really is strategic for the context and for Europe. We've got about 10 minutes left before we have to wrap up our session. So I'm going to ask you all a question. And when we're talking about breaking this violent cycle, if there's an action or a policy which needs to be underscored or to be worked on, which one would you choose? Madame Nori, might it be education? Is that the part of public policy which needs to be highlighted? Yeah, it's the main. Without education, we have nothing. Education will teach children, first and foremost, to respect others. If there's no education, then violence will intensify. I don't think anyone was expecting to see the types of violence that we are currently seeing. So yes, education is absolutely vital all over the world, not only in Europe, not only in Afghanistan, but absolutely everywhere around the world. Really important. Dora Meredith now.
Cool question.
It's the last one.
Yes. I think we've got to get much better at using the different tools that we have for foreign policy to actually create change and to actually have much more tailored strategies working in partnership, with local actors to actually drive change in different countries. And then, to make the political space that we say to politicians, actually, you need a much more holistic strategy. You need to be thinking about investing in these things like education and making the case to show why it's important that Europe, for example, thinks about the broader implications.
Alors, informer.
Inform, educate, use political tools and institutions such as Europe. Mr. KHADHRAOUI, a fourth idea from you. One idea for me is that the world is increasingly economic and militarized. There are trillions of dollars being invested in the military last year, whereas more than in any other sector. So we need to get around the table the private sector, the tech industry, defense industry, which is more and more centralized. It's less and less state-based. And we have to open up the conversation. We have to reach out to economic and industrial deciders to let them know that their economic decisions have to include respect for human rights, for women, for children, and for society in general. Madame Morad, the floor is yours. If you'd like to, in a couple of words, give us your idea or conclusion. Putting an end to violence, what a question. Well, I agree with everything that my colleagues have said. We really have to break the machine that creates violence and create opportunities for success. We need a lot more dialogue. Thank you. Short and sweet, very clear. The final word from Madame HESSAMI. Thank you. Take your time. We've got plenty of time. This is such a serious issue. Yeah, reinforcing women's capacity, training, awareness, leadership, for women, all very important. These things have been mentioned by Mona. I would like to say that our association has trained over 60 podcasters. We've trained 400 women. They have become journalists. They have become investigative journalists. They are covering very sensitive issues. They have become program managers. They really are now trainers in their own rights. They can train others. 90% of that has been possible, or 90% of the funding has come from the European Union. So we've created this network of women, which is very active today. But then all of a sudden, all of the financing disappeared. No funds available. Nobody was able to give us any money anymore. Trump was elected in January 2022. The US aid was cancelled, and so there's no funding for us anymore. And that has impacted our network. We have 2 training centres. Just imagine 2 training centres that are training women in countries where women hardly have any rights. You can just imagine how difficult that is anyway. And these training centres are under threat of being closed next year because there is no funding. We are trying to find the funding, but it's really difficult. As I was explaining earlier on to Hichem, we're not a local organisation, so we don't get local funding. And we're not big enough, like a big French or international association, to submit to calls for projects. The issue of human rights and gender questions have become forbidden in many countries. Human rights have become taboo in some countries. Women's rights, if you mention women's rights in some countries, then you're really frowned upon. And so these women are working as journalists and they are risking their lives. We need to go and get public funds, yes, but as you already mentioned, Hichem, businesses, private business must also participate in this work to stabilize and to create platforms. Thank you very much for letting me speak out. Well, that's natural. Maxime, where's Keynes in all of this? Well, Keynes, I think he's sleeping. He's fallen asleep. Between the 2 world wars, he said that profit had to be given somewhere, and men and women were aiming towards capitalism rather than fighting one another. So the more you fight in capitalism, it means that the more you are fighting in real terms. I think this notion, Keynes' notion of that time between the world wars, I think he was wrong. He got it wrong. But to wrap up, I would say that at the end of this debate, I have a heavy heart, having heard everything. But then I allow myself a glimmer of hope, because I know there's a lot of activism here. There's a lot of awareness and activity to protect women's rights. And I would perhaps come back on a few of those ideas. Fraternity. And I'm sorry to say this, that we need more sorority. There are many economic studies which show that in Senegal, for example, there's showing about how women are included into the economy. They are a booster for growth, and it's important for women to be included in the bank networks. They can get loans, etc. And Hichem rose the question of the defence sector. Yeah, of course, before, the system was very hierarchical. In France, of course, we've got the special ministry which runs all that, and then there are lots of calls for tender. We've got a lot of companies that are innovating in weaponry, and I think in the specs we're going to have to include the notion of civil peace, civilian peace. Technically, I think it's possible. We know how to reduce the power of weapons, but the question of drones is all important. More generally, we've got this question of institutions, which has been in our discussion. We talked about these institutions perhaps having better planning. We've talked about climate urban planning, and also measures to solve conflict. I think we need to look deeper in that on a European scale. These institutions now have to be used as a capacity. We need to consider that every human being should be able to be fed, housed, and have dignity. So how can we shift from a predatory economy, focusing on resources, to the situation of women, to the climate, shift towards a more inclusive economy which recognizes everybody? It may be a utopia, but I think that yesterday's utopia is today's reality, and I think there are many resources. If you zoom out a little bit, decentralization, for example, if you go to Africa, for example, there's Pan-African unification with citizenship and dignity for each African. So perhaps we here in the West should stand still and take stock. So thank you very much to everybody for their contributions. Well, thank you, Maxime Menouet, Hichem KHADHRAOUI, Shayda HESSAMI, Dora MEREDITH, Mona MORAD, and Shayla Nouri. Thank you very much for this discussion. It's been a long discussion. It's had some heavy subjects, but it does bring a glimmer of hope because you are active.